Maintenant, je vous présente Madame Francine Ravenet, secrétaire exécutive adjointe de l'APES. Pour ceux qui ne connaissent pas ces sigles, elles sont pour Accord partiel élargi sur le sport. C'est une plateforme de coopération intergouvernementale dans le Conseil de l'Europe. Madame Francine, elle a fait plus de 20 ans qu'elle travaille dans les organisations internationales et sa spécialité, c'est diversité, égalité et de la communication. Elle va nous parler aujourd'hui en anglais sur la diversité et le travail de l'APES dans ce domaine. Francine, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Laura. Well, good afternoon. It's my absolute pleasure to be speaking to you all here on Zoom for the Sports That Connects Us series, Le Sport ens Connecta. I'd like to thank Minister Silvia Riva, Minister of Culture and Sports of the Government of Andorra, and the Sports Department for inviting me to speak to you all today on the topic of the Drets dels esportistes transgènere i intersexi en relació amb la lluita contra el dopatge. Estic molt contenta I agraïda de ser aquí amb vosaltres. So, as mentioned,
thank you so much for this Catalan, perfect Catalan. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I did a little practicing, I have to be honest. So I work in the Council of Europe, as you know already, in the enlarged partial agreement on sport. And I just wanted to do a little reminder, first of all, because very often we don't know what the Council of Europe is in comparison with other international organizations. So I just wanted to clarify that it isn't the European Union. The Council of Europe is a human rights organization set up in 1949 in Strasbourg. It's promoting and safeguarding human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. And so distinct from the European Union, which has its main headquarters in Brussels. EPAS itself is the enlarged partial agreement on sport within the Council of Europe. And there are, I would say, three main bodies which make up EPAS. There are 40 member states in its governing board. And of course, we're delighted that Andorra counts amongst them all as well. So thanks to the authorities for being with us today. Also 29 consultative committee members. So these are grassroots sports organizations. It could be ENCSO, UEFA, Play the Game. And we really use those organizations to have a good sense of dialogue about what's happening in the grassroots sports arena, as well as a statutory committee made up of permanent representations to the Council of Europe in Strasbourg. And I wanted to just give you a small quote before we start. I think it's very important because EPAS recently very much supported the adoption and the preparation of the new text of the revised European Sports Charter. And this European Sports Charter, which was adopted this year by the Council of Europe's Committees of Ministers, specifically states that there should be no discrimination on the grounds of sex, race, colour, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, association with a national minority, property, birth, or other status shall be permitted in the access to sports facilities or sports activities. So I think it's really important just to talk about the context in which EPAS is working. And Laura, if you want to share the screen now for the slides, we're going to slide 2 straight away. So as mentioned, just a small point of clarification, I'm going to talk primarily about the issue of protecting transgender and intersex rights in the sports arena, rather than the issue of anti-doping. So we're going to be focusing not on anti-doping with me, but we'll hear more from Sophie Kwesny and Carla Seo afterwards in that area. So how does EPAS promote diversity in sport? So primarily, we have a diversity conference every 2 years. And I wanted to just mention a few of the topics we've worked on previously: promoting gender equality in sport, fighting racism and violence through sport, and combating homophobia in sport. So the subject area for the diversity conference is always approved by the governing board of EPAS at its ministerial meetings, and we need to have ministerial approval as well. This year's topic, which we were very proud of, was promoting and protecting the human rights of transgender and intersex athletes in sporting competitions. And we actually were not limiting it to sporting competitions that were elite level competitions, but really grassroots sporting competitions as well. So it was really a wide remit. So Why did we want to have such a conference? One of the main areas, much like your conference this afternoon actually, is that we wanted to raise awareness on this subject area, because there's a lot of confusion of terminology, and a lot of stereotypes that abound, and that impacts on the way the subject is dealt with. We wanted to increase knowledge, and as you'll hear in a moment, that was one of our main focuses of the conference. And it doesn't stop with the conference, it's an ongoing work for EPAS. And we really wanted to sensitize the public to a relatively misunderstood subject area. So the conference was open widely. We benefited it from being hybrid, as many events are nowadays. So we could really transmit it online and have a wide audience following the conference. And I think that we did achieve this to a large extent. We had people joining the conference internationally as well. And the other focus that I think it's important to stress is that we wanted to have a focus on the human rights perspective, very much the Council of Europe's main line of work, rather than just reducing these topics to biological definitions, but much more from the issue of human rights. And this is something that the Council of Europe and EPAS have been working on for many years. EPAS has had many human rights fora as well, where we've discussed the issue of the rights of intersex athletes, notably Caster Semenya, whose case is currently at the European Court of Human Rights, as Carlos will tell us in a little while as well. One of the really things that was important for our conference was that it opened with the presence of Roxana Maracianu, the French minister responsible for sport, because that really gave us the insight then that there was real commitment from France, and that for the 2024 Olympics, the protection of the human rights of athletes would be really high on the agenda. So I think that's really important to stress as well, as another reason for the importance of hosting the diversity conference in September. So one of the issues I'd say is that most high level and amateur sporting competitions are organised in sex specific categories. Now these were established when female competitors began entering the field. Previously, at the start, of course, it was a field exclusively reserved for males. This approach has led to an establishment of clear-cut physiological criteria to split competitors into male and female categories. And the problem with this is it de facto can exclude intersex people. So I wanted to give you a definition for intersex, but I know that Carlos will provide some more later, I'm sure of this. For us in our conference, we consider it people who are born with sex characteristics that do not fit typical binary notions of female or male bodies. An example would be, of course, Annette Negesa, who was one of the speakers at our conference. She is an intersex athlete from Uganda, and she had naturally higher levels of testosterone. Another athlete in the same situation is Francine Nyonsoba, and you can see on my slide here the picture of Francine on the right hand side and also at the bottom. She's here photographed winning the 5,000 meters at the 45th edition of the Van Damme Memorial Competition in September. And Francine in particular identifies as being a woman, but with intersex characteristics. Another way of describing intersex is sometimes to speak about variations in sex development or differences in sex development. But again, I'm looking forward to hearing Carlos speaking a little bit more about that definition later on. Now, moving on to transgender, the binary categories of sports competitions excludes the gender dimension. So for transgender people, where their gender identity doesn't align with what has been culturally associated with the sex assigned at birth, this is a problem. So we're glad to see that there has been progress even since the conference in this area, but I think it's important to be familiar about the terms intersex and transgender from the outset. And you can't just compare the two of them. I just want to mention something else before I go on to the details of the conference actually. We do have some resources, because what we spoke about at the start was that the aim of the conference was raise awareness, to provide resources for people so they could learn more about this subject area. And so we made sure that our web pages were packed full of information. So I really invite you to look at those web pages. You can find the full recording of the conference, and I think it's worth following the full recording of the conference because it's a very interesting conference, lots of testimonies. We also have the fact sheet, conclusions, and portraits of some athletes, some of whom are intersex, some of whom are transgender, and it was to really combat this problem that there is a dehumanization very often of transgender and intersex athletes, especially in the sensationalist press. And we really wanted to combat that. So I would recommend that you check out the webpage for the resources, especially just to find out a little bit more. The other aspect that we've included in the resources page are links to some documentaries. There's a very moving documentary about Annette Negesa. I really recommend that you check that documentary out as well. It tells you about her life. And we have more definitions from the BASES expert statements on eligibility for sex categories in sport, for transgender athletes, and for DSD athletes. So that's all available on the resources page of the website as well. Now, coming back to our conference, we divided it into two main roundtables. The first one was looking at biology, gender, sex, and sport. And the second one was on protecting human rights whilst ensuring fair competition rules. And we lost the slides, but it doesn't matter. We can bring them back if you like. So for the first roundtable, the focus was very much on discussions around whether or not biological definitions are sufficient, how they can be redundant, how they can be helpful. Also the historical context. Sonja Erikainen really presented a full background of the historical context of these sporting competitions, and very much looking at the complexity of the issue, taking into account those different areas. The next roundtable was on protecting human rights whilst ensuring fair competition rules. And we were absolutely thrilled to have present Dr. Richard Budgett from the IOC, Chief Medical Officer, who announced that the upcoming framework would be delivered by the end of the year, which they were, and again, which Carlos will mention in a little while. And it was good to have the IOC's commitment to the debate. We thought that was really positive. And alongside Dr. Richard Budgett, we had a representative from Human Rights Watch, Carl Knight, and also a representative from a women's international sports organization, just to have a really strong debate. And again, you can find information about all of that on the recording and on the webpage. And then what we really wanted to do was not just to have a talking shop kind of event where nothing comes out of it. We wanted to really bring in the voices of athletes who are either transgender or intersex. And the first one I've mentioned a few times, Annette Negesa. I mean, her testimony is extremely moving. And so the whole conference began with her being interviewed and describing her experiences. She was very brave. For those of you who don't know her story, she was thinking that she was about to run in the Olympics. And then she was told that after a doping test, anti-doping test, they found out that she had higher levels of testosterone. And on following that, she was encouraged to undergo some medical intervention. But I would really recommend that you listen to her testimony because it's very moving and very difficult to listen to, actually. We also heard from Chris Mosier. Chris is a really successful transgender man athlete based in the US. And what was really interesting about his testimony was that as a transgender man and being white, he said that he entered a world of male privilege. And that's quite different. And no one ever contests his right to win races. So that was very interesting. And the other transgender athlete who was in the conference was Natalie Washington, who transitioned from male to female, and who now leads work on football versus transphobia. And I think, as I said, it's really important to bring in athletes into the discussions, people who are concerned, rather than it just coming from federations or sports organizations, or even international organizations like the Council of Europe. I think those voices are vital. So we can share the slides with you afterwards, I think, as well, because I have a list of really interesting press articles that were released after the conference. Because I mentioned at the start, the aim was to raise awareness and to encourage debate. And so we have a few articles. One was in Marca, a Spanish one, El Consejo de Europa pide protección para las deportistas intersexuales y transgéneros. And we had some in the French press as well. Le Comité olympique repousse encore la publication des règles pour les sportives trans by Comité. And I think it's very interesting to see these articles to learn more about the debate going forwards as well. And again, that was vital for us, was to bring in the press and have a press conference. That doesn't normally happen after this type of diversity conference. Then we had a series of conclusions, of course. So you can go to the website again and find the really extensive list of recommendations that we made. Recommendations were made to public authorities, to sports federations, to the International Olympic Committee, to the European Gay and Lesbian Sports Federation, which is a member of the Consultative Committee of EPAS. And amongst these recommendations, it was very much to set up a network to protect and promote the rights of transgender and intersex athletes. That was one of the main recommendations that we made. And in terms of EPAS's work, it was to keep on following this subject area and make sure that we were really working hard on protection and promoting human rights for these athletes. We are going to release shortly a diversity study that was prepared by a number of experts. We'll put that on the webpage again under resources very soon. And as I mentioned, the IOC has adopted a new framework, which Carlos will describe a little bit later. We do feel slightly in part responsible for having given a little bit of an impetus to those that new regulations coming through from the IOC. Although we can't take too much credit, but I am kind of proud that we were involved in the whole process as well. And we certainly had a lot of discussions with them about it. So thank you very much for your attention. I'm really looking forward to hearing questions later on in the chat. And again, please don't hesitate to find out more about this conference because it's packed full of data and that's what we're aiming to do, share information going forwards. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Francine, for your presentation. We may, when we, excuse me, when we share the video, we can also share this, some of this information that you have just talked about, so people can check it in internet and they can just expand their knowledge. Bon, maintenant, je vous présente Madame Sophie Kwasny. Elle est chef de la division du sport du Conseil de l'Europe et responsable de l'APES et de la promotion et implémentation d'instruments juridiques novateurs défendant l'intégrité et les valeurs du sport. Elle est diplômée de l'Université des droits de Strasbourg et travaille pour le Conseil de l'Europe depuis plus de 20 ans sur des sujets variés allant de la protection des données aux réformes pénitentiaires ou de l'indépendance de la justice ou le droit de la nationalité, excuse-moi. Madame Kwasny, nous sommes très honorés d'avoir votre participation aujourd'hui dans cette conférence.
Good afternoon, bonjour à toutes et à tous. C'est moi qui suis honorée d'être avec vous. Contrairement à Francine, je suis désolée, mais je ne vais même pas m'essayer à autre chose que ma langue maternelle. Peut-être le titre, l'e-sport ens connecta, et je m'arrêterai là. Je suis désolée. Donc un grand merci. Comme vous le savez, en fait, je suis venue à cet événement un peu en cours d'organisation et en dernière minute, mais j'avais très envie de pouvoir y participer et d'apprendre. Donc je voudrais évidemment remercier le ministère de la Culture et du Sport et le secrétariat d'État et Madame la ministre, Madame Riva, de nous avoir fait l'honneur de nous accueillir et de traiter ce sujet pour cette journée qui nous unit, c'est vraiment important. Alors effectivement, j'ai pris la responsabilité de l'accord partiel élargi pour le sport, l'APES, dernièrement, tout début décembre, suite à une restructuration qui vient mettre ensemble sous un même toit nos conventions sport, dont j'ai été chargée précédemment, et l'accord partiel élargi pour le sport. L'idée étant évidemment de créer synergie et complémentarité dans ce qui est fait par les membres de l'APES, alors à la fois côté gouvernemental, mais aussi côté société civile et comité consultatif, et ce qui est fait par nos conventions, et je vais évidemment vous parler de la convention anti-dopage. Donc voilà un peu pour l'historique. Donc effectivement, pour le côté APES, c'est un peu plus récent. Alors, le sujet donc d'aujourd'hui, droit des athlètes transgenres intersexes en relation à la lutte contre le dopage. Vous avez déjà pu entendre de Francine vraiment les travaux spécifiques liés à ces athlètes, pas nécessairement uniquement dans un contexte antidopage, mais de façon générale. Et donc, je voudrais à nouveau bien insister sur le cadre général, et Francine l'a présenté, mais je pense que c'est toujours bon de répéter les messages importants. Et là, du coup, on aura été bilingue, elle l'aura dit en anglais, et moi, je le redirai en français. Je voudrais citer, évidemment, la Charte européenne du sport révisée, qui vient d'être adoptée en octobre. Et cette révision, elle reflète évidemment l'évolution des politiques en matière sportive, l'évolution de nos sociétés au cours de ces dernières décennies, puisque la dernière version de cette charte remontait déjà à pas mal de temps. Et donc évidemment, cette évolution de nos sociétés, qui se traduit aussi dans les politiques sportives, est consacrée dans cette charte, qui est un instrument puissant, salué par tous, et novateur pour beaucoup d'aspects qu'il contient. Alors évidemment, le principe, c'est de donner à chaque individu la possibilité de pratiquer le sport. Ça, je pense que c'est le fer de lance de cette charte. L'objectif, et il faut le rappeler puisqu'on est une organisation intergouvernementale, c'est de guider les pays dans le développement de ces politiques. Donc, réaffirmer ce principe-là, c'était évidemment essentiel. Et là, je vais faire le lien évidemment avec l'identité et l'essence même du Conseil de l'Europe. Le Conseil de l'Europe, c'est État de droit, démocratie et droits de l'homme. Et je finis par droits de l'homme parce que là, dans cette charte, c'est vraiment ce qui est mis en avant. Vous avez évidemment une recommandation qui est faite au gouvernement de protéger et de développer un sport fondé sur des valeurs, conditions préalables pour optimiser les bénéfices individuels et sociaux du sport. Et le premier point de cet aspect sport fondé sur des valeurs, c'est le respect des droits de l'homme, des personnes qui participent ou qui sont exposées à des activités. Alors, justement, ce sport fondé sur des valeurs, vous avez une section entière de la charte européenne sur le sport révisé qui en traite, et la première partie, c'est un article sur les droits de l'homme. Donc, vraiment garantir les droits de l'homme des sportifs et appliquer une politique de tolérance zéro face à la violence et toute forme de discrimination. Un message très fort. S'agissant de la citation en fait que Francine vous a donnée, je vais également la répéter puisque je pense qu'en français, ça aura aussi son poids. Donc, aucune discrimination fondée sur la race, la couleur, la langue, la religion, le genre ou l'orientation sexuelle, les opinions politiques ou autres, l'origine nationale ou sociale, l'appartenance à une minorité nationale, la fortune, la naissance ou toute autre situation n'est autorisée dans l'accès aux installations sportives ou aux activités sportives. C'est à nouveau ce droit au sport pour tous. Et cet article et cette disposition sur la discrimination, elle est évidemment en lien direct avec l'article 14 de la Convention européenne des droits de l'homme, mais en allant bien au-delà, en le développant et en le mettant au goût du jour. Donc voilà, mon premier message, c'était ce message-là, c'est ce cadre général de la Charte européenne du sport révisée qui s'applique à tout athlète. Alors, permettez-moi maintenant d'en venir plus spécifiquement à nos travaux antidopage, puisque c'est aussi la lumière du jour et de notre discussion aujourd'hui. On a une convention au Conseil de l'Europe, la convention antidopage, qui est une convention qui n'est pas récente, elle date de la fin des années 80. C'est un succès au Conseil de l'Europe. Il n'y a pas énormément de nos conventions qui ont été ratifiées par tous les États membres. Et là, c'est le cas pour cette convention. Donc, évidemment, l'Andorre y est partie et depuis 2006. Mais il faut noter qu'on a même des pays non européens qui sont partis à cette convention. Donc, au total, ce sont 52 pays qui se réunissent sous, on appelle ça le groupe de suivi. C'est l'instance qui est établie par cette convention. On a eu d'ailleurs réunion de ce groupe hier et avant-hier, oui, hier et avant-hier. Et donc, 52 pays qui travaillent ensemble à toutes les questions antidopage, des plus techniques aux plus politiques. Et alors, au plus politique, il y a aussi justement cette action normative de ce groupe de suivi de ces 52 pays qui adoptent des recommandations ou préparent des instruments pour le comité des ministres. Et donc, j'aimerais porter à votre attention 2 textes qui viennent d'être discutés, examinés par le groupe de suivi de la Convention antidopage. L'un ayant trait en fait au droit à un procès équitable, l'article 6 de la Convention européenne des droits de l'homme, et comment on traduit ça dans un contexte de procédure antidopage. Et l'autre texte est relatif à la protection des lanceurs d'alerte. Je pense que les deux voilà, sont importants aussi pour nos échanges d'aujourd'hui. Alors, s'agissant du projet de recommandation, c'est toujours un projet, il n'est pas finalisé, sur une procédure équitable applicable à la procédure antidopage dans le sport. C'est un document qui s'appuie sur une recommandation de ce groupe de suivi qui date déjà de 2017, mais qu'on fait évoluer parce que la jurisprudence de la Cour européenne des droits de l'homme a aussi évolué sur ce sujet. Et alors, il y a des principes forts qui sont rappelés, je vais les lister, c'est assez synthétique. Donc, toute personne à l'encontre de laquelle une procédure antidopage est engagée devrait, premièrement, avoir droit à une procédure de première instance équitable. Première instance. Deuxième point, dans un délai raisonnable. Ensuite, devant une instance d'audition qui soit indépendante et impartiale, principe d'indépendance et d'impartialité du panel en fait qui va prendre la décision, et avoir une voie de recours, possibilité de porter cette décision en appel. Alors, ce projet de texte contient plusieurs principes clés. Je vais entrer dans le détail juste de quelques-uns, pas tous, mais le texte sera prochainement disponible. Le premier point, c'est que ceux qui vont mener l'enquête et qui vont investiguer doivent être des enquêteurs nommés par une institution qui opère indépendamment de toute autorité sportive. Donc, éviter l'ingérence dans la façon dont les enquêtes vont être menées. L'instance d'audition, ce panel qui va examiner le cas, eh bien, il doit y avoir des préconisations sur sa composition. On doit définir la nomination et les conditions de service de ses membres. Et il doit aussi y avoir une définition des procédures que cette instance d'audition va suivre. La compétence de cette instance d'audition, évidemment, elle va traiter de la recevabilité, elle va devoir fournir une décision motivée sur le fond de l'affaire et elle doit pouvoir infliger des sanctions. Le principe, et ça c'est un principe fondamental qu'on met en avant, et je l'ai déjà souligné, c'est l'indépendance et l'impartialité de cette instance d'audition. Les athlètes, les sportifs concernés ont le droit d'être entendus. Chacun doit avoir le droit de défendre sa cause devant cette instance d'audition. Et le dernier principe que je voudrais souligner, mais il y en a d'autres, mais je le souligne parce que c'est un principe qui n'est pas consensuel, c'est le principe de la publicité des audiences. Nous, Conseil de l'Europe, sur la base de la jurisprudence de la Cour et de cette identité droits de l'homme, nous soutenons que les procédures devraient être menées en séance publique. Ça devrait être la position par défaut. Et qu'ensuite, en fonction des spécificités du cas, à la demande d'une partie ou à l'initiative du panel, dans l'intérêt du respect de la moralité, de l'ordre public, du droit au respect de la vie privée des personnes concernées, eh bien, il puisse y avoir des séances à huis clos. Donc voilà, ce texte, c'est un peu en avant-première puisqu'il n'est pas finalisé, mais je voulais le porter à votre connaissance. C'est un texte important. L'autre texte dont je vous ai parlé, c'est le texte sur la protection des lanceurs d'alerte. Et là aussi, un texte novateur, un texte important à l'heure où on sait que plusieurs pays travaillent à la mise en place de canaux de reporting et de systèmes qui vont protéger justement les lanceurs d'alerte. Eh bien, cette recommandation, en fait, elle a également plusieurs parties. La première, c'est les droits et les responsabilités des lanceurs d'alerte, droit de communiquer des informations, droit à la confidentialité, droit à des canaux de communication de ces infos qui soient sûrs, évidemment. Je n'entre pas dans tout le détail. La deuxième partie importante, c'est la responsabilité en matière de protection des lanceurs d'alerte. C'est justement qu'est-ce que les instances gouvernementales ou les instances sportives doivent mettre en place pour assurer en fait qu'un système soit fiable et qu'on puisse encourager ce genre de reporting. Et enfin, la dernière partie du texte qui est aussi importante, c'est la coopération et les mécanismes de suivi. Et c'est à la fois de la coordination nationale et internationale parce que souvent, on est face à des cas qui dépassent les frontières. Donc voilà les travaux en cours au sein du Conseil de l'Europe qui j'imagine vous intéresseront. Pour finir mon intervention, juste brièvement mentionner nos autres conventions sport, parce que le sport nous fait rêver, le sport est magique, mais les défis sont nombreux et notamment notre convention qui nous permet de lutter contre la manipulation des compétitions sportives, c'est la convention de Macolin, et également une autre convention qui là touche plus vraiment à l'intégrité personnelle des participants à des événements sportifs, c'est la convention dite de Saint-Denis sur la sécurité, sûreté et service des événements sportifs majeurs. Donc voilà notre triptyque avec la convention antidopage, notre triptyque de l'action qu'on mène en matière sportive aux côtés de l'APES. Je vous remercie une fois encore de votre attention, de votre invitation. Et je vais malheureusement, et c'est la raison du fait que je m'adressais à vous dans ce cadre-là et pas ensuite dans la partie questions-réponses, je vais, comme Madame la Ministre, suivre de façon mobile le reste des échanges. Donc je couperai ma caméra, mais je continuerai de vous écouter. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup, Madame Cosny. C'était très intéressant. Et ça a été une très bonne idée de partager l'information en français et en anglais. Comme ça, s'il y a quelqu'un qui ne comprend pas l'anglais, il peut le suivre aussi en français. C'est parfait. Et le même, si vous avez quelques lignes que vous voulez partager pour cette information que vous avez expliquée, on peut le compartir aussi quand on envoie le vidéo. D'accord? Bon, now I change to English again. Now we will have the great honor to listen Mr. Carlos Sayao. Carlos is a former competitive swimmer who represented in his time Canada at the World Championships and Commonwealth Games. And now, and from there, he brought his passion for sport in presenting athletes and sport organization in complex disputes like the ones that we are going to treat today in this conference as an advocate. He's going to talk about the eligibility regulations for women athletes with differences in sexual development and for transgender athletes. Carlos, welcome, and we are listening to you.
Merci beaucoup, Laura, et bon après-midi tout le monde. Malheureusement, ma langue maternelle, c'est l'anglais, donc je vais donner ma présentation en anglais. Et je ne vais même pas essayer de parler quelques mots en catalan, mais je peux faire une introduction en français. C'est un plaisir d'être ici avec vous aujourd'hui. Et je veux remercier le ministère de la Culture et du Sport et le secrétaire de l'État pour l'invitation. Et je veux vous féliciter pour avoir le courage d'aborder ce sujet vraiment complexe et difficile, mais aussi vraiment important. Et je vais remercier aussi Sophie et Francine et le Conseil d'Europe pour le travail très important que vous faites de façon générale, mais aussi plus spécifiquement sur le sujet dont on va parler aujourd'hui. Donc, now I will switch to English. And I will share my screen to start the presentation. All right, so I'm going to be speaking today about the eligibility rules for transgender athletes and athletes with differences in sexual development. And my experience in this area, and I will touch on the connection to the anti-doping regime as well. So my experience in this area around transgender and DSD is through my involvement in some legal cases over the years, specifically involving Duty Chand and Castor Semenya on the women's side, and Chris Mosier, as Francine mentioned, who's a trans man, a triathlete. So I'll just preface today by saying, this can be quite a sensitive topic. People have very passionate views on both sides of the debate. But I think it's incumbent on us to always approach this issue with respect and compassion for the athletes in question. Many athletes who are transgender, who have differences in sexual development, have suffered systemic discrimination and oppression inside and outside of the world of sport, and that's all for no fault of their own. So the lens of respect and compassion, I think, is an important one in these discussions. And there's been a lot of change and progress in the area generally around human rights of transgender people and individuals with intersex conditions or differences in sexual development. It's an evolving area. And just on terminology, the terminology is also evolving, and it can have different meanings in different contexts and is often in flux. So with that introduction, I'll just go through an outline of the topics I'm going to address today. So I'll spend a few minutes speaking about the history of sex testing in sport. It's actually a long-standing phenomenon for women in sport. I'll spend a few minutes speaking about the difference between transgender and DSD conditions. Then I'll speak a little bit about the legal challenges specifically to world athletics DSD regulations, which I was involved in and I'm still involved in. And these challenges were brought by two athletes who I mentioned, Duty Chand and Castor Semenya. I'll speak briefly about the transgender regulations with which I'm familiar. So that's World Athletics and World Rugby's transgender regulations. And then I'll touch on the very recent IOC framework on fairness, inclusion, and non-discrimination, which Francine mentioned. And then at the end, I'll try to make some connections with the anti-doping rules. I mean, in a theoretical way, this is a very different issue around transgender and DSD, but there is some overlap, especially specifically around the use of analytical anti-doping results and the TUE therapeutic use exemption program that WADA administers, and how that relates to transgender athletes. So I'll start off then with the history of sex testing in sport. And this quote, "A History of Ignorance," this was actually part of the testimony of Arne Lundqvist, who was, I think, the head of the IOC for several years, a very senior sporting official, during his testimony at the Duty Chand case at the Court of Arbitration for Sport, when he was referring to how sporting organizations had dealt with sex testing of women athletes over time. So in the 1960s, what were known as nude parades were held at high-level sports, including the Olympic Games. And this involved essentially female athletes being lined up, and male doctors would go through the line and essentially assess physically by manual genital inspections whether or not the athletes were women and could compete in the women's category. And so this was all obviously a very traumatic experience for a lot of women, and it caused some women to withdraw from sport. So thankfully, authorities moved away from that in the 70s and 90s and replaced it with chromosomal tests. And the idea around the nude parades and the chromosomal tests was to essentially to prevent fraud. So it was to prevent men from masquerading as women to try to gain some sort of advantage. Okay, thank you. I think someone was off mute. But this particular series of chromosome tests were not very accurate, and it caused some women who were legitimate women to be excluded from competition just because of their chromosomal makeup. The famous case is a Spanish runner called Maria Jose Patino, who many of you may have heard of, who was caught by this regulation, and she challenged it in the 1980s, and eventually the IOC supported her, and this rule was abolished by World Athletics. Then in the 2000s to the early 2010s, sport moved to what was kind of known as an ad hoc gender verification approach. So there weren't really published rules, but instead, if on a case-by-case basis, there was some suspicion around the appearance of a woman athlete, that could trigger very intrusive examinations and clinical procedures to try to verify their sex. And a few athletes were publicly sort of caught under this because of leaked details to the media. Shanti Soundarajan in 2006 was an Indian runner who had medals taken away, suspicions that she wasn't really a woman. And there's public reports that she attempted suicide after that. And then Caster Semenya, originally in 2009, was caught by this approach at the World Championships in Berlin, a highly public, highly damaging experience for her. So then in 2011, essentially World Athletics published a rule around hyperandrogenism, which is elevated testosterone levels. So it was the beginning of moving away from sort of an ad hoc targeted approach, at least to having a specific rule that would apply more broadly. And I'll speak about those rules a little bit later in the presentation. So a few words then on the difference between transgender and DSD. So as Francine mentioned, generally speaking, transgender athletes have a gender identity and usually also a legal sex that is different from their assigned sex at birth. So we have situations of male to female athletes, male to female transgender, or female to male transgender. And there can be very different sort of procedures that the different athletes follow. There's no sort of standard medical intervention that each person will undergo. It's a very specific process that is informed by a number of factors, including consultations with medical professionals. And so that kind of leads to the next point. Often transgender athletes, they desire or they wish to undergo what are called gender affirming medical interventions. So in the case of a male to female athlete, they will wish to undergo testosterone suppression procedures to essentially sort of feminize their body so that their physical appearance aligns with their gender identity. That's not sort of a blanket principle, but it is often the case for transgender athletes and transgender people. Now, that's very different than athletes with differences in sex development, which is known as DSDs, and I have the asterisks there. DSDs are sometimes also referred just more simply to sex variations or intersex conditions. So athletes with DSDs have a gender identity, the ones we're concerned with, have a gender identity and legal sex that is the same as their assigned sex at birth. So Here we're usually concerned with women, so it's women who were born as women, they were assigned the female sex at birth, they grew up as women, they have always trained as women, they have always competed as women their whole lives. There's been no transition, no change in gender identity or legal sex during their lives. And as Francine mentioned, these athletes have genetic variations that can cause atypical sex characteristics. So that's sex characteristics that don't fully align with what we typically assume as male or female ends of the spectrum. And one of the sex characteristics that can vary in athletes with differences in sex development is hormone levels. So testosterone levels are the ones that we're most concerned with in the world of sport. Now, important difference here, athletes with differences in sex development usually do not wish to undergo gender affirming interventions. So these athletes tend to have, grown into their bodies, they're comfortable with their bodies, they're comfortable with who they are. And unlike the transgender situation, these athletes do not desire to change their bodies in any way. And so that is an important difference, I think, that often gets overlooked by sports federations when speaking about how both categories of athletes should just be happy to undergo medical interventions. There's a difference there between transgender and DSD. And then finally, I think this is clear, but I just want to make it crystal clear that these conditions, transgender and DSD, are both very different from doping. It has nothing to do with doping. The testosterone levels, the testosterone levels for DSD athletes are entirely natural, so they are produced by their bodies. Whereas obviously with doping, people can dope with testosterone. The testosterone's exogenously administered. And then it's a bit more nuanced around transgender, but if we're looking at male to female athletes, the key point to know there is those athletes have not taken testosterone. Usually transgender women have actually suppressed their testosterone. So it's not a question of the exogenous administration of testosterone around DSD athletes and male to female transgender athletes. So moving on then now to the DSD side of the picture, I'll speak a little bit about the cases with which I was involved. So again, this is on DSD. We're not talking about trans athletes when we're talking about these athletes. Again, these are athletes who were born, raised, trained, competed all their lives as women, but they have genetic variations that cause natural testosterone levels to be elevated. So the first case that really led to a serious legal challenge was the Duty Chand case. So Duty Chand is shown in the sort of the right-hand side of the screen there. She was, when she contacted us, a teenage sprinter from rural India, a 100-meter sprinter, who essentially she was ready to go to the Commonwealth Games in Glasgow in 2014. And just before she was about to leave, someone told her she couldn't go because she had failed some tests. And then soon after that, her case was leaked to the media. There were headlines in the papers all around India that said, Duty Chand, boy or girl. Very damaging discourse, questioning her gender, a very traumatic experience for her. And luckily, some athletes, advocates actually went to her aid, including, most importantly, Payosni Mitra, who is a very important athlete advocate in this area who works directly with athletes, went to her aid and essentially coordinated pro bono legal representation by myself and my partner, Jim Bunting, to bring her case to the Court of Arbitration for Sport, essentially challenging World Athletics regulation that was in place at that time, known as the hyperandrogenism regulation. And that regulation essentially imposed a limit on the natural testosterone levels for women. It applied to all women across all athletics events and competitions. And the way it worked was the athletes had to reduce and limit and maintain their testosterone levels at a certain level, which was 10 nanomoles per liter, in order to be eligible to compete in sport. Otherwise, if they refused to do this, they would have to quit sport. And the way in which these regulations were implemented involved several rounds of very intrusive medical examinations, clinical examinations, blood testing, ultrasounds, you name it. And then once the athlete was confirmed to have high testosterone and have to reduce her testosterone levels, the options to do so involved either taking hormonal suppression sort of therapy, which could be through oral contraceptives or other stronger hormones, or to undergo surgical procedures to reduce testosterone. So these are all, from our perspective as duties lawyers, very, very intrusive, some of them irreversible medical procedures simply to compete as she was born in the women's category. So this case was brought to the Court of Arbitration for Sport, and we were successful on behalf of Duty Chand in a decision in July 2015. Essentially, the court held that the IAAF, World Athletics, then known as the IAAF, did not have enough evidence around performance advantage caused by natural testosterone to justify what was acknowledged to be a discriminatory regulation. And specifically, the regulation was discriminatory as between men and women because it only imposed restrictions and limits on women. And it also was discriminatory within the women's category because women who had a natural genetic trait, high testosterone, were required to undergo very onerous restrictions, whereas other women were not. So the court essentially suspended the operation of that regulation and told the IAAF, if you want to continue to regulate in this area, you need to come back with better evidence on the performance advantage caused by natural testosterone levels. So the IAAF went essentially, before I go there, so the regulation was suspended in July 2015, and there was no regulation in place in Rio for the Rio Olympics. Duty Chand qualified for India just barely, and she competed in the 100 meters. She didn't advance past the heats, but that was a phenomenal experience for her to represent India. It was the first time, I think, a woman had represented India in the 100 meters in decades. And then, of course, as most of us probably know, Caster Semenya won gold in the 800 meters, and Francine Niyonsaba won silver in that event. So then World Athletics came back in 2018 with further evidence, which they had commissioned, and also came back with, importantly, essentially a brand new regulation in response to the decision of the Court of Arbitration for Sport. And the key change to the regulation was that it was limited in its scope compared to the previous regulation. So whereas the previous regulation applied to all women, this regulation applies only to women with certain differences in sexual development. And the biggest difference, I think, was that the scope of application for the events that it covered was limited. So whereas the previous regulation that targeted Duty Chand and others was applied across all track and field events. The new regulation applied specifically only to events in running between 400 meters and a mile, which overlap exactly with Caster Semenya's sort of specialty. The premise was the same, though, that affected athletes had to reduce and maintain their testosterone levels. The limit was actually cut in half from 10 nanomoles per liter to 5, and they had to undergo medical interventions in order to compete in these covered events at the international level. So we were engaged by Caster Semenya, along with her counsel in South Africa, to challenge this regulation at the Court of Arbitration for Sport. We did so. It was a very lengthy and complex arbitration with a week-long hearing. We had something like 15 experts in all kinds of areas of medicine and sports science, psychology. And the Court of Arbitration for Sport issued a split decision in May of 2019. So 2 arbitrators upheld the regulation, and the 3rd arbitrator would have invalidated it. But of course, the decisions are made by majority at the Court of Arbitration for Sport, so the regulation was allowed to stay in place. Even though the majority upheld the regulation, they expressed concerns around several parts of its application. So specifically, there were concerns expressed around the lack of evidence to justify the application of these regulations to certain events. So the longer distance events, the 1500, there was a question there. There was concerns expressed around the difficulty to comply with the testosterone limit using oral contraceptives, because there hadn't been very many athletes at all who had done this. And so there was a real concern, having brought the level down from 10 to 5, as to whether athletes taking oral contraceptives would be able to maintain their testosterone levels at 5, or whether more harmful and more serious medical interventions would be required. And then if so, there were some concerns expressed around the side effects of those stronger medical interventions that might be required. So that was the decision of the Court of Arbitration for Sport in 2019. There was an appeal brought by Caster Semenya to the Swiss Supreme Court. As some may know, the Court of Arbitration for Sport's rules require appeals to be brought to the Swiss Supreme Court. So that appeal was brought. It's very limited grounds of appeal at the Swiss Supreme Court. So they denied the appeal in a decision in August of 2020. And we have now brought, on behalf of Caster Semenya, a application to the European Court of Human Rights, as Francine mentioned, which is pending before the court. Written submissions have been made, and we are waiting to see how the process will unfold. And Caster has alleged several violations of convention rights, including Article 14, the protection against non-discrimination, Article 8, the right to private life, and more specifically within Article 8, the right to bodily integrity and bodily autonomy in the face of these interventions and examinations. And also a challenge on grounds of Article 3, the prohibition on degrading treatment, again around the clinical examinations and the requirement to take oral contraceptives against one's desire or will. So that's the European Court of Human Rights case. We're not sure when we'll have a decision in that case. So that's sort of where we're at on the DSD side. I'll switch now then to the transgender side. And here again, I'll speak mostly about male to female transgender, which is the more controversial issue. So World Athletics, again, has a very detailed regulation for transgender athletes. And for the male to female athletes, it applies to all athletics events. So unlike the DSD regulation, which only applies to a few events, this regulation applies to all events, and it's a similar premise where transgender women have to reduce and maintain their testosterone levels to compete in the women's category. Again, just to be clear, as I was saying before, many transgender women will want to do this for reasons unrelated to sport anyway. So I think that's why we haven't had so much controversy around this specific regulation. But we have had some controversy around this regulation, which is World Rugby, which is a blanket exclusion of transgender women from rugby, from women's rugby. This is justified or purportedly justified on the basis of both performance and safety. The suggestion that transgender women are bigger and can cause danger to non-transgender women in this competing against each other in the sport of rugby. But there's been a lot of discussion around the World Rugby regulations, but I'm not aware of if there's been a legal challenge, at least not to my knowledge at this point. So that's, again, that's the male to female side, as Francine mentioned in connection with Chris Mosier. Female to male cases are often less sort of controversial. Interesting reference to the sense of male privilege, but I think the idea is there really isn't much of a concern around performance advantage going from female to male. So usually it's just a requirement to have sort of a genuine expression of one's gender identity or legal sex, and no testing, no medical interventions required for those situations. So moving on now to the IOC's framework. This is quite an important development, I think. It's very recent. And so I'll go through a few points. It applies to both DSD athletes and transgender athletes, and it's not a specific regulation. It's a framework. So it sets out some principles for sporting organizations to follow, and it replaces a one-size-fits-all approach that was in place before, which was the IOC's 2015 so-called consensus statement. Which sort of required, which essentially imposed a testosterone limit in all sports. So they've moved away from that. It was developed after extensive consultation with a wide range of stakeholders. So unlike the previous rules and frameworks, which were usually developed, in behind closed doors with no consultation or very limited consultation at all. The IOC, to its credit, took a very broad consultative approach. They took their time to come up with this framework. I think it was more than 2 years of consultations involving affected athletes, which, as Francine mentioned, a critical viewpoint in this issue. Human rights experts, legal experts, sports representatives from international federations, medical experts, and this was all sort of under the direction of Richard Budgett, who's the head of the IOC medical department. And as I mentioned, it's just guiding principles for each federation to implement based on the sport's specific context. So a recognition that a one-size-fits-all approach doesn't work, given the diversity of the sports in the Olympic program. And then, so this is brand new, and the IOC has said that it will provide informational sessions around the rollout of these principles following the Beijing 2022 Games. So this is a slide that I pulled from the media presentation that the IOC gave in connection with the release of this framework. So again, it's their guiding principles, which sporting federations can and should consider when they decide whether to impose specific eligibility regulations and if they decide to impose those regulations, how those regulations should be designed. And the reference there on the left, they should consider all of the 10 principles, not just the ones that they want to consider. So it's not some sort of a pick and choose menu. It's everything needs to be taken into account. So just quickly going through the principles, inclusion is the first one, and so that recognizes the IOC's position that sport is a human right and everyone should be eligible to participate in sport without discrimination, abuse, or prejudice, and that's regardless of their gender identity or any sex variations. The second one is prevention of harm. So here, the physical and mental health and well-being of athletes should be prioritized, and sporting organizations should identify and prevent any negative impacts to the health of athletes. The next principle, non-discrimination. No athlete should be subjected to targeted testing based only on their gender identity or sex variations. There has to be sort of a justification for doing so. Of course, fairness obviously is in there. So the language is that no athlete should have an advantage that disproportionately exceeds other advantages in elite sport. And that's the fairness principle is I think a controversial one, and how to define what is fair in sport, I think is quite a challenge. So the notion is that the advantage has to disproportionately exceed other advantages in elite sport. So there's a recognition that every person's body is different, every person's circumstance is different, and so some people will have advantages over others. And so the principle here is that it's not just any advantage that should be regulated, it's only an advantage that is disproportionate to the other advantages in elite sport. And that should be determined on a sport by sport basis. So related to that is the no presumption of advantage principle, and the sort of connected principle that these should be evidence-based. And this is really important because at this stage, there isn't much evidence at all specifically on transgender and DSD athletes and measuring what, if any, advantage they actually have compared to other women athletes in the different sports. Most of the evidence is done as a proxy in terms of evidence on men and men having different testosterone levels, but there's very limited evidence on women. And so the IOC has said that there shouldn't be any presumption that transgender or athletes with DSDs have an advantage based on, for example, their appearance. There needs to be peer-reviewed evidence that shows a consistent and disproportionate advantage or an unpreventable safety risk. That evidence needs to be available, it needs to be robust before sporting federations can go forward with implementing eligibility regulations. So a very strong statement from the IOC there. The rest of the principles, quickly, primacy of health and bodily autonomy. So there shouldn't be any pressure to undergo medically unnecessary procedures. The IOC says there should not be any need to do gynecological examinations, which was a feature and still is a feature of some of these regulations. The stakeholder-centered approach. So these eligibility rules should be designed with stakeholder input, specifically affected athletes. And also there's a reference there that decisions around the eligibility of athletes should follow basic standards of procedural fairness and impartiality. And I think this links in a little bit with what Sophie was talking about in the doping context. There has been in recent time, I think in the doping world, a real strengthening of procedural fairness in the 2021 Water Code and some other texts. So a similar recognition here that even though this is not doping, the decisions need to be taken in a procedurally fair manner if they're going to result in potentially excluding or requiring athletes to undergo very invasive medical interventions against their desires. Privacy, this is an important one given the blunders we had with cases to date. Duty Chan's case, there was a privacy link. Castro Semenya's case, there was a privacy breach. So these cases need to be done confidentially. The assessments, there needs to be informed consent for the collection of data and for any medical procedures. And here there's a bit of a crossover with doping, which I'll talk about at the end of my presentation. And then the final principle is periodic review, so that the framework and any eligibility rules that sporting organizations impose should be reviewed periodically, taking into account developments in ethical, legal, human rights, scientific information. Because as I said, this is an evolving area, so things will change going forward, that's for sure. So that's the IOC's framework. I spent a bit of time on it because it is quite an important step forward, I think, and it will probably have some important repercussions going forward as more sporting federations consider these issues. So finally, for the last couple of minutes, the connection between transgender and DSD to the anti-doping regime. And there's a couple ways, clear ways where this comes into play. So the first is around use of samples. So there was a little bit of controversy around this footnote in the WADA code, which appeared very late in the drafting of the WADA code, the January 2021 version, where all of a sudden the code said an international federation could use data from a doping control test to monitor eligibility relating to transgender and other eligibility rules. So this is an interesting issue, and I think it's nuanced from my personal perspective, because one of the issues around these rules was that as they were previously drafted, athletes could be targeted just by way of suspicion. So a competitor could, complain to a sporting official that this athlete seemed to be running too fast, or she looked too strong, she looked manly. That in itself could trigger investigations and examinations of the athlete, which is obviously very highly problematic. Sporting organizations are moving away from that now. And I think one sort of objective way to identify athletes who have elevated testosterone, natural testosterone levels, is through anti-doping results. So in a way, provided there's adequate consent and privacy protection, the use by federations of anti-doping results to identify athletes who might be subjected to these rules is an objective way to do it, which will hopefully eliminate this idea of whistleblowing or suspicion amongst competitors. So there's been some controversy around this. I think it's nuanced, but it certainly raises issues around use of data for clearly a non-anti-doping purpose. And then I'll just contrast that with the IOC framework. This is a provision from it, which was later than the WADA code, and it says, medical information about an athlete, including testosterone levels collected in the context of anti-doping, must be handled in compliance with applicable privacy laws and should only be used for the purposes disclosed to the athlete at the time such information is collected. So that's interesting because, I was subjected to anti-doping tests, tens of years ago when I was a swimmer, and maybe there was some asterisk that said, we WADA are allowed to use this data however we want, but there certainly wasn't, and I don't think there is today, any clear indication that the anti-doping results that an athlete is going to have based on their test can be used for the purposes of transgender or DSD eligibility rules. So an interesting potential tension there. So that's one clear area where there's a linkage between the transgender and DSD rules and the anti-doping regime. Another one, which I will admit I'm not extremely familiar with, perhaps Natalia can help in this area, is that transgender athletes can be eligible for therapeutic use exemptions. And as I understand it, this is sort of a case-by-case basis that is highly specific. It requires significant evidence from personal physicians around gender dysphoria, around the appropriate procedures and substances that the athletes should take for their transition. And so we have on the female to male side, TUEs being issued for testosterone because that is part of the approved transition program, medical transition program for these athletes. And then on the male to female side, spironolactone, which is a testosterone suppressing hormone, is prohibited for some other reason under the WADA code, but transgender women can have a TUE to be able to take spironolactone as part of their medical transition. And I put here maybe T. There's an interesting case that we're familiar with of an athlete here in Canada called Kristen Worley. She's a transgender woman cyclist who basically said, you know, I have gone through my transition from male to female, and as a result of that transition, my testosterone production is 0, and therefore, you know, I should be eligible for a TUE to have at least some degree of testosterone, because as I think most of us know, women do produce testosterone naturally, generally speaking, in most cases at a much lower level than males, but there is usually a small level of testosterone. So she at least made a case that she should have a TUE for testosterone. I'm not sure how that issue eventually was resolved, but I just raised it because it is an interesting sort of anecdotal story with which I'm familiar. So I think that's all I'll say on the TUE issue, and that brings me to the end of my remarks, but I will be sticking around for the panel and for the Q&A in case anyone has any questions on any of the things I've discussed. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Carlos, for sharing with us your knowledge. It really is a very interesting subject, but at the same time, it also is really complex. So you can start talking about that, and then you can just follow a few lines. So it's like it expands itself. But thank you very much. If someone has any question, I have already written in the chat that if someone wants to do some questions, just write in there, and then I will if you write it in Catalan or Spanish, it's okay, I can translate it, and I will ask for to Carlos. If you want to write it later, it's okay too, so Carlos will stay here with us and we can refer to him during the roundtable, okay? Ok, maintenant, changer d'idiome une autre fois. On passe à la dernière part de la conférence. On va faire une table ronde avec la participation de Madame Francine Ravenet en tant que représentante de l'APES, Madame Natalia Font en tant que représentante de l'AGAT, Agence Andorrane Antidopage, pour ceux qui ne le savent pas, Monsieur Caïn Subizarreta, spécialiste de la politique sportive et invité spécial de l'AGAT, et avec la compagnie de Monsieur Carlos Sayao. Nous commencerons avec vous, Natalia, si ça va bien. Comme directrice de l'AGAT, est-ce que vous pouvez partager avec nous la situation qu'on a en Andorre et votre connaissance dans ces sujets?
Oui, merci Laura. En premier, je voulais vous remercier, Laura, Nadia et le secrétariat au sport pour organiser une réunion, une table ronde sur ce sujet. Je crois que c'est très intéressant de pouvoir rapprocher ce domaine et les différents points de vue des experts qu'on a eu le plaisir d'avoir à notre population, à nos sportifs et à nos fédérations. Et plus particulièrement, je voulais remercier les experts d'avoir voulu participer dans cette table ronde et de partager leurs connaissances très concrètes et spécialisées sur ce domaine, car on peut avoir accès à des différentes conférences, par exemple celle-ci que Francine a commentée, mais c'est toujours un plaisir de les avoir ici et de pouvoir commenter et poser des questions sur ce domaine, quand c'est un domaine qui est vraiment très intéressant et qui va nous donner des raisons pour en discuter pendant longtemps. À part ceci, je voulais faire une petite présentation de moi-même. Non? Je suis Natalia Von, je suis la directrice de l'agence antidopage. Et ça fait pas vraiment des années que j'ai commencé à écouter des cas comme ça. Je crois que c'est un domaine très intéressant, car chaque fois, il y aura plus d'athlètes qui vont faire face à des situations compliquées pour eux-mêmes. Et des réunions, des tables rondes comme celle-ci peuvent leur aider. Ceux qui ont les problèmes maintenant et ceux qui peuvent avoir les problèmes au futur, pour savoir, pour avoir de l'expertise, pour savoir des cas qui ont eu lieu et pour comprendre mieux la situation pour pouvoir y actuer. Ça fait des jours que Laura m'a proposé de participer sur cette table ronde. En Andorre, notre agence est très petite, comme notre pays. On n'a pas beaucoup d'expertise sur ce domaine. Et quand Laura l'a proposé, je me suis dit que peut-être c'était une bonne idée d'inviter Ekaïn Subisarreta. C'est un collègue. Ça fait quelques années que je le connais et j'ai pu discuter plusieurs fois avec lui sur ce domaine et je suis passionnée chaque fois que j'ai pu partager des conversations avec lui. Alors, j'ai cru que c'était très convenient de l'inviter et d'essayer de transmettre cette passion qui a à tous vous et essayer de vous donner un point de vue un peu plus proche que ce que Carlos Aya ou Francine ont donné avec les exemples, parce que parfois on a l'idée que ce sont des cas lointains, non? des autres pays, et il y en a ici juste à côté. Il y en a en Espagne, il y en a en France, et pourquoi pas, peut-être dans pas beaucoup de temps, on peut en avoir en Andorre, et c'est une bonne raison pour en parler et pour en discuter. Alors, Ekaïn, on a déjà présenté sa personne, non? Lui, il est un investigateur sur ce domaine. Et j'espère qu'il va pouvoir nous partager des bons cas sur leur expertise.
Merci Natalia, merci à la GAD aussi et merci à vous au secrétariat. Tu as été un peu humble en disant que là vous êtes petite à Andorre, mais c'est quand même une initiative assez novatrice, je dirais, du moins du côté institutionnel. Ce n'est pas toujours un ministère des Sports qui fait ce type d'initiative, crée ce type d'initiative. Un des désavantages, entre guillemets, de passer en dernier, c'est que la plupart des choses que j'avais pensé de dire ont déjà été dites par Francine, Laura, Natalia, Carlos, ça, mais je vais quand même le répéter et les dire, et j'espère que ce sera éventuellement avec un peu plus de proximité pour les gens sur le terrain qui éventuellement sont là et assistent à cette table ronde. Et voilà, comme tu as bien dit, je suis chercheur et comme chercheur intéressé sur ces sujets, d'abord, je voulais signaler cette complexité sur laquelle Laura a déjà parlé. C'est complexité du dossier. C'est fait que finalement, sur un dossier qui touche à un très grand nombre de personnes et institutions, et soit aussi en évolution constante, parce que finalement, ça fait des années, c'est pas un dossier si récent que l'on croit souvent, je vais en revenir, mais il évolue constamment. Du coup, il y a tous les jours des nouvelles études publiées, des nouvelles réalités qui sont exposées, et c'est un dossier que, à moi particulièrement, m'apprend des choses tous les jours, si je peux le dire comme ça, et qu'on m'oblige aussi à être attentive et à être informé des derniers événements. Ça a ses côtés passionnants aussi, mais très, très, très évolutifs. Et comme j'ai déjà mentionné, même si souvent on pense à ces dossiers comme étant assez récents, déjà Carlos a mentionné que ce n'est pas tellement le cas, que ça date déjà des années, ça a commencé dans les années 60, et ça a vachement évolué depuis. Mais ce qui fait que maintenant, c'est peut-être le fait que ça intéresse plus le public. Bon, l'intérêt plus récent du public, c'est, je dirais, la conséquence de cette sortie du dossier de la sphère des institutions sportives. La controverse, c'est un peu, c'est devenu du domaine public. Du coup, on dirait que ça a l'air un peu récent. C'est quand même relativement vieille et a beaucoup évolué dans ces temps-là. Et moi, je me suis intéressé par cette évolution historique. Et je voulais juste, avant de donner la parole au public, je voulais juste partager 3 conclusions comme ça générales de ces études que je fais sur l'évolution historique. Il y en a plusieurs points que Carlos a déjà évoqués dans sa présentation. En premier, je dirais que ce dossier a été et continue à être très, très, très marqué par les croyances et les préjugés des personnes qui sont engagées et impliquées, et des croyances aussi scientifiques et des croyances des personnes qui font de la science, aussi des chercheurs, nous-mêmes, moi-même, je suis inclus là-bas. Et l'évolution dont je parlais a eu lieu car ces croyances ont été peu à peu désarmées, mises en question et faussées. Je pense donc que c'est bien de mettre ce type de vérité scientifique, je dis vérité entre guillemets, en question et d'en débattre, parce que plusieurs seront sûrement mises en question récemment. Et c'est pour cela que je voulais aussi profiter pour inviter tout le monde finalement à mettre en question ses propres croyances ou vérités, parce que souvent quand je participe sur Twitter ou sur d'autres arènes à des conversations, à des débats sur ces sujets, c'est pas évident d'argumenter sur certains nombres de points, parce que les gens, on croit tous à nos propres vérités, pour le dire comme ça entre guillemets encore, et parce que plusieurs de ces vérités peuvent avoir une certaine base scientifique. Donc, j'invite tout le monde à tout questionner, si je peux le dire comme ça rapidement, et même ces vérités qui paraissent scientifiquement fondées. Et deuxième point, j'aimerais aussi signaler que l'on doit considérer, comme il a déjà été dit, les préjudices ou attentes causées à toutes les personnes impliquées ou touchées par ces réglementations, qui inclut bien sûr, que ce soit clair, les athlètes qui n'ont pas pu obtenir de médailles pour avoir concouru comme des athlètes qu'elles ne considèrent pas comme étant admissibles dans leur catégorie, parce que c'est aussi un des arguments souvent défendus. Simplement, il faut que ce soit clair, je pense que ça a été déjà bien signalé, mais que les attentes causées aux athlètes exclus ou mises en question sont beaucoup plus sérieuses. Donc, il faut être au clair sur cela, il faut que cela soit répété encore, et comprendre que nous-mêmes, nous avons aussi une responsabilité comme citoyen, mais aussi comme peut-être entraîneur de club ou responsable des fédérations nationales ou professionnel du ministère, parce que nous pouvons nous-mêmes, avec nos actions, avec nos commentaires ou croyances, blesser d'autres personnes, et ce sera sûrement sans aucune base scientifique, même si on croit vraiment à nos vérités, à nous. Et je voulais voilà, rappeler en lien avec ça que la plupart des femmes qui ont été exclues, pour ne pas dire toutes, hein, toutes les femmes qui ont été exclues dans l'histoire récente ont été écartées alléguant des arguments qui ne sont plus valables, des arguments maintenant obsolètes et scientifiquement invalides. Donc, je pense qu'on a tous la responsabilité de faire gaffe à nos actions et être très, très, très prudent dans ce sens-là, notamment au moment d'exclure ou de faire des choix qui peuvent être très, très, très compliqués. Voilà. Par rapport à... Et troisième point, juste je vais finir avec cela, je vais aussi signaler que l'étude d'histoire montre que les athlètes intersexuels ou transsexuels qui ont excellé ne sont qu'une minorité, voire, je dirais, ce sont des cas anecdotiques. La grande majorité des femmes transsexuelles ou intersexuelles n'arrivent pas à un niveau de performance, voilà, de gagner des médailles d'or dans les Jeux olympiques. Et pourtant, ce sont ces quelques cas anecdotiques qui font vraiment, qui apparaissent partout dans le média, et que nous aussi, finalement, on connaît que, sûrement, on connaît que ces types de cas, et ça nous empêche en fait d'avoir notre vision de cette controverse et de nous positionner aussi différemment. Et que je pense voilà, qu'il faut questionner aussi cette idée, cet argument qui disent que le fait d'accepter les femmes intersexuelles ou transsexuelles dans les sports féminins met en danger les sports féminins. Je pense que c'est l'argument que j'entends le plus et que ça arrive le plus souvent, au moins dans mon cas. Ce n'est pas le cas de tout le monde. Moi, un club, en tant que, et à l'université aussi, ce sont des arguments contre lesquels je me bats le plus souvent. Et voilà, je voulais juste dire qu'il faut qu'il ne faut pas porter une attention exagérée finalement à ces cas. Et comme ces derniers jours avec les cas d'Elia Thomas, je ne sais pas si vous avez suivi ou non, mais sur Twitter, maintenant tout le monde connaît les sports, notamment cette nageuse transsexuelle par ses excellentes performances, et tout le monde du coup regarde ces règles du CIE avec peur, non? Je pense qu'on doit aller au-delà de tout cela. Et voilà. Et Laura ou Natalia, je vais vous céder la parole. Je m'arrête là.
Merci beaucoup, Ekaïn. C'est vraiment très intéressant tout ce que vous nous expliquez. Et merci beaucoup pour c'est le petit cas. Alors, on commence à avoir quelques questions au chat, mais première, on commence avec des questions qu'on avait préparées pour la table ronde, et après, on passe à la question de chat. Quel croyez-vous que c'est l'impact de ces différences, parlant de différences entre des personnes qui peuvent être intersexes ou transgènres, sur le sport en général et sur le sport de haut niveau? Par exemple, Francine?
Alors, avant de répondre aux questions, je vais parler en français là, donc pour continuer dans le français. Je voudrais juste remercier à Ekaïn aussi parce qu'il y avait plusieurs commentaires que vous avez fait en fait qui me fait penser à notre conférence sur la diversité, notamment la référence à l'histoire du sport, parce que j'en ai pas parlé, mais on avait aussi un expert dans l'histoire du sport, c'est Pierre-Jean Vazel, et je pense que son intervention serait intéressante. Et ce qui nous intéressait beaucoup, c'était aussi justement le point de vue de représentant du monde de la biologie, si on veut dire, Dr. Alan Williams, qui était très sûr de son dialogue. Or, les autres n'étaient pas forcément en accord avec lui. Et ça, je trouve intéressant quand même de faire un petit commentaire sur cet aspect-là avant de répondre aux questions de Laura. Donc, sur la question, moi, je pense que plutôt que de parler de différences, il faudrait parler de similitudes parce que l'aspect inclusion a aussi l'impact sur le sport de haut niveau que le sport en général. Et il faudrait, je pense, encourager dès le niveau les plus jeunes d'avoir une attitude le plus inclusive possible. Donc, c'est vraiment d'éduquer les plus jeunes et comme ça, on peut espérer que dans l'avenir, avec les athlètes qui sont vraiment en compétition à haut niveau, s'ils arrivent là-bas, qu'ils ont déjà eu cette éducation à la base, parce que c'est l'éducation qui va changer. Donc, l'aspect inclusion, tolérance, l'apprentissage des droits de l'homme, travailler avec les autres. Donc, pour moi, ça, c'est quelque chose qui relie ces deux domaines, le sport en général et le sport de haut niveau. Et maintenant, c'est clair que le sport de haut niveau, il y a souvent, comme on dit, des finances qui rentrent en jeu. Parce que qui va gagner le plus, c'est forcément les hommes et pas les femmes. Donc, il y a vraiment tout un discours autour de cela aussi. Mais moi, je préfère vraiment me concentrer sur l'aspect droit de l'homme, l'aspect inclusion, et que c'est ça qui est pareil dans les deux cas. Donc, voilà, ce sera ma réponse. Natalia, si vous avez envie de rajouter quelque chose, peut-être.
Oui, au fait, je me rejoins à votre opinion. Et je suis très confidente au pouvoir de l'éducation en ce qui concerne la lutte contre le dopage. Cette année, on a fait une très grande action, non, en mettant le standard d'éducation comme un standard obligatoire. Il faut pousser fort avec l'éducation car je crois que les gros changements proviennent toujours des changements à très jeunes âges et n'importe quel est le domaine qu'on traite, je crois que si on essaye de remplir les têtes des enfants avec des valeurs et des bons pensements sur quoi qu'il se soit, au futur, c'est toujours des bonnes réponses. Alors, si on a détecté ceci maintenant, ou ça fait déjà des années, mais je ne sais pas, par exemple, il y a le framework du comité olympique que c'est un outil clé pour y travailler. Je crois que c'est un bon commencement pour essayer de faire des actions liées à ceci, à essayer de commencer des petits âges pour essayer d'avoir des gros changements au futur ou au futur proche.
Francine, j'ai vraiment aimé comme vous avez changé la perspective de différentes similitudes. C'est très important. C'est vraiment parfois il y a des manières de parler qu'on ne se rend pas compte et peut-être pas la bonne manière. Carlos, mais peut-être vous avez aussi une opinion sur le sujet?
Oui, merci beaucoup, Laura. I'm going to switch to English. I think I agree with both Natalia and Francine. I think at the grassroots level, education is absolutely key because the amount of prejudice that exists right now around particularly transgender athletes at the grassroots level is frankly appalling. There is currently very, very contentious litigation going on in the United States around participation of transgender women in high school sports. So, you know, and really we should be questioning at the high school level. So we're not talking about elite sports here. It's high school competition in sports like women's track and field. What benefit we're getting by sending the message that transgender women or transgender girls should be excluded from competition, right? These girls have their whole lives ahead of them. It's really, really problematic around the language that's being thrown around, the prejudice that we're seeing, particularly in the United States, around sort of the high school sport situation. For elite sports, I think, you know, there's an interesting discussion here around the suggestion that allowing transgender women or women with differences in sexual development to compete in the women's category will somehow, threaten the integrity of the women's category. There are suggestions that if these women are allowed to compete, women who aren't transgender or don't have DSDs will drop out of sport. There's suggestions that they'll be incentivized to dope because that's the only way they'll be able to stay competitive. This to me is just purely hypothetical fear mongering. There's no basis. I mean, when you look at someone like Caster Semenya, she is an absolute inspiration for girls, women, for everyone in South Africa. So the suggestion that allowing her to compete in the women's category will somehow cause the women's category to collapse and cause people to resort to doping, to me, I think is really problematic and needs to be investigated, because I really think, why can't transgender women and women with DSDs be an inspiration to young girls and boys to participate in sports? To me, that's the message of inclusion that we should be promoting across all levels of sport, both grassroots and high elite sport.
Thank you, Carlos. As you say, I think at the end, the important thing is the inclusion. So that's the path. Francine, do you have something else to?
I want to just reference something. So, the slides that I showed right at the very start, there's a picture at the top of Francine Niyonsova, and she's being hugged by her competitor in the women's race that she just won. And that image was really important for me to show as well, because as you say, Carlos, it's about supporting and not seeing someone with an unfair competitive advantage at all, but, really embracing people who just won the race. So I think that was an important image to kind of like just flag up there, because it wasn't just chosen by chance. I really wanted to put that there on the image just to think about afterwards.
Yes, as I like to say, sometimes images are better than words. So this image should have been really impact and transmitting one. Someone wants to say something else about this subject? I pass to the next question. Okay, this is a good one. Comment défendre les droits des femmes ayant un niveau élevé de testostérone dans les sports de haut niveau? Peut-être Caïn a quelques opinions dans ce sujet.
Est-ce que tu peux répéter la question, s'il te plaît?
Oui. Comment défendre les droits des femmes ayant un niveau élevé de testostérone dans les sports de haut niveau?
Ouais, je pense que ce n'est pas facile, mais c'est peut-être Francine ou Carlos qui ont plus d'expérience pour répondre à cette question. Et, comme ça, d'emblée, je dirais qu'il y a soit le schéma institutionnel, si on accepte de le parcourir, soit le schéma en fait de résister ou au moins de contrer ces règlements et d'essayer de ne pas se faire appliquer, ne pas se vouloir obliger à subir des traitements médicaux. C'est un peu plus ce que Carlos a fait, donc je pense que c'est mieux pour moi de céder la parole, soit à Carlos, soit à Francine. Je pense qu'ils auront plus d'éléments de réponse.
C'est très bien sauvé votre réponse, Caïn. Merci beaucoup. Carlos ou Francine, est-ce que vous avez quelque chose pour rapporter dans ces... Oui, Carlos?
Oui, merci. I think there's a few points, and I honestly think the IOC framework really does move us forward here. In the past, these regulations were being, as I said, implemented behind closed doors, designed and implemented behind closed doors. There was no awareness of what was happening. There was no awareness of the types of testing and the types of medical intervention that were being recommended or required. So I think the fact that this has now become a much more common subject of debate, and the IOC has put forward these principles, I think is very important to try to safeguard the rights of the affected athletes. So I think that's a real step forward. I think the suggestion that each sport needs to really think this through around the circumstances of their own sport and base their decisions on robust, peer-reviewed evidence without any prejudice or presumption of advantage, I think is also another way to restrict the application of these rules, which will also preserve the rights of the athletes who are affected. On the DSD side, I think the European Court of Human Rights decision in the Semenya case will be a very important one, I think, which will, tell us sort of a little bit more around this specific World Athletics regulation and whether there's, incompatibilities with the convention protected rights. So I agree with Ekaim that it's a difficult issue. Sporting organizations have and are going to continue to tackle this. So I think really I'm very pleased with the IOC framework, that I think if sporting organizations do take that seriously, we will have a more tailored, more respectful, more compassionate set of regulations. Even with World Athletics, I mean, their new regulation does have enhanced rules around, how athletes are selected to be tested. As I said, a move away from this suspicion approach. There's a provision for an ombudsperson to try to explain these complicated issues to the affected athletes. So, we're seeing a recognition, even in the regulations that are already out there, that the athletes affected do need to be protected as they go through the process. So hopefully those types of procedures will be bolstered going forward.
Thank you very much, Carlos. We can see that you really have been working on this subject, because it was not an easy question, as Ekaim said. Well, I'm happy to say that at the end, I'm happy to say that at the end, things are changing in our world, not only in sports but in general. So people eventually is being more open-minded, and I'm confident that someday we will acquire a rule, regimen that involves everything, and inclusion and everything. Francine wants to have raised her hand. No, you are muted. No.
Thank you. No, but good, thank you. No, just quickly, I wanted to just mention one of the recommendations that we had actually at the conclusion of the conference, which was that international sports federations should adopt a duty of care towards all athletes. And I think that's a very important notion, that federations look after their own athletes as well. And I saw in the chat, or I've closed my chat down by mistake, a comment which was very interesting as well, about the fact that it's so difficult to, yes, Patrick Morales, yeah, thank you for your comment, because quite right, I'm going to reopen the chat now. You're absolutely right. It's very hard to normalize body types, etc. This is really difficult. So I think that was a really useful comment that you've made there. So thank you for your comment as well. I just wanted to draw attention to it.
Thank you, Francine. Oh, Natalia.
Just to add, I think, well, I speak in English now. I think it's very interesting also to do roundtables or meetings or conferences like those ones we are doing, because I think it's important to share, to make knowledge to everybody, to listen about this issue and to make conscientiousness to all the stakeholders related on sports, because if it's not like this, maybe it's difficult to build I don't know, regulations in the national level, international level. So it's important the work that you are doing, Francine, to expand the voice, no, and also the role that Council of Europe is doing. Also, maybe not far away, we will find a new recommendation related to this kind of issues, and it will be very interesting, for example, for NADOS to have recommendations on this topic, to know the path to follow, or to know how to deal without knowledge on that. So I think both things are very important on it. Or people like Carlos, who fights for people who face this kind of issues in their life, and I don't know if maybe sometimes it's a bit late when the cases are solved, because maybe Caster Semenya will be a bit older when the case will be finished, and she wouldn't be able to demonstrate their sportive level at that time. But like you said, it will be a good example for the rest of the athletes.
Thank you, Natalia, for your intervention. Ekaim has raised his hand.
Should I continue in English? It's like
Comme vous êtes plus confortable. La langue
du coup, je vais changer au français. Je suis plus confortable avec le français. Et non, je voulais aussi dire, voilà, comme Natalia, en lien avec tout ce qui vient de dire, ce qui vient d'être dit, et aussi avec les commentaires de Patrick, et que je pense qu'un autre point intéressant, c'est aussi d'essayer de se rapprocher des sportifs, parce que au moins moi, de mon expérience, dans les différents événements de ce type dans lesquels je puis participer comme audience, comme public, il y a toujours eu non, la seule fois qu'il y a eu des sportifs, c'était des sportifs eux-mêmes ou elles-mêmes font partie de ces groupes de sportifs intersexuels ou sportifs transsexuels, mais ce n'est pas courant de voir des sportifs qui sont conventionnels, entre guillemets, qui parlent de sujets, parce que finalement, elles aussi, elles sont touchées, ou au moins, du moins dans les arguments qu'on met sûrement contre ce type de règlement, elles sont mobilisées. Donc, je pense que ça doit être très, très, très important aussi. Et la photo de Francine était très jolie, je peux dire comme ça, mais malheureusement, c'est plus courant de voir des photos à l'inverse, notamment dans les cas de Caster Semenya, où elle a gagné, elle a remporté, je ne sais pas si c'était la médaille d'or du mondial de Berlin, et personne ne veut lui serrer la main parce qu'elle considère qu'elle n'est pas légitime ou admissible. Donc, je pense que c'est aussi une prochaine étape ou un autre à faire. Là, je m'arrête parce que je vois des mains déjà.
Merci beaucoup, Ekaim. Et on a deux mains élevées. On va faire par ordre. Francine, c'était la première. Francine.
Merci, Laura. En fait, je vais encore revenir à la conférence parce qu'en fait, comme j'avais dit au départ, c'était ouvert par Roxana Mareciano. Et c'était important d'avoir ce ministre du Sport qui était présent dans la conférence parce que justement, Ekaim, un groupe d'athlètes français ont signé une charte en fait pour dénoncer tout ce qui n'allait pas dans le traitement d'Annette Neguessa. Donc, et on a invité quelques-uns de participer à la conférence de presse aussi à la fin. Et en fait, c'était bien parce qu'on a pu faire un rapprochement justement entre les athlètes qui ont levé leur voix pour soutenir des athlètes intersexes et de les présenter, d'être en présence aussi du ministre. Donc, en fait, c'est un peu stratégique, mais je trouve que c'est un bon exemple. Et comme vous avez dit, là, c'est bien que les autres athlètes participent, soutiennent et comprennent, mais ça vient aussi de cette notion d'éducation, d'inclusion de la plus jeune jeunesse, en fait. Voilà, c'est ce que je voulais rajouter.
Merci beaucoup, Francine. Carlos, c'est votre tour.
Yeah, merci. Just to pick up on that as well, it's a very important point that Ekaim raised. You know, we will need to have all women athletes on board with inclusion in order for this to succeed. And the point about education that Francine raised is a key one, which I discussed earlier. I mean, we represent also athletes who are subjected to doping infractions. And as some of us know, under the doping rules, one of the mitigating factors around the length of the suspension is the degree of anti-doping education that athletes have had. And frankly, I am always appalled, not always, but in most cases appalled at the lack of information and education that is provided by the anti-doping authorities, even authorities in countries like Canada, which are not short on resources. There's a real dearth of education that's provided. And so it's a similar thing, I think, on the issue of transgender and DSD athletes, where athletes simply they're not informed about these issues. And I think once they become informed, there's going to be a lot more sensitivity, and we won't see some of the examples that Ekaim was talking about with Caster Semenya, where athletes refuse to shake her hands, make very, very harmful comments in the media about her looks and her gender. And we'll see athletes becoming more sympathetic. And an example of that is actually an athlete called Madeleine Pape, who is a very interesting story. She's an Australian 800-meter runner who competed against Caster Semenya at the 2008 Beijing Olympic Games. I think they ran in the finals together. And Madeleine Pape says that at that time, she thought it was unfair to have to compete with Caster Semenya. She was upset about it. But then she underwent her own sort of transformation. She took studies at the University of Wisconsin in Madison on gender in sport. She informed herself of the issue, and she is now one of the strongest proponents of Caster Semenya and of having inclusion of athletes with DSDs in sport. She testified on behalf of Duty Chand at the Court of Arbitration for Sport in favor of Duty's case. She's a very articulate spokesperson who changed her view 100% after gaining an education on these issues. So I think education is really the key. It's totally lacking. And again, I really hope with the IOC's framework that there is a robust rollout and a robust education program, not only for sporting officials, but also for athletes who are competing.
Thank you very much, Carlos. This roundtable is getting really interesting. Natalia, would you like to add something?
Yes, Carlos said something about the resources, no? Maybe it's an important key to be able to get the education to the athletes, but I think it's not the most important thing, because sometimes resources don't allow to attend the athletes. We have big countries. It's quite difficult to get close to the athletes. Sometimes little countries like us have it's easier to do this, because in the opposite door we have the federations, and it's quite easy to develop education programs to attend all level of athletes. And I can imagine how difficult it could be in such big countries like Canada, for example. But we are lucky now. No, we are in the internet, internet or the new revolution tools. No. And I hope that we can imagine a future with almost all the athletes educated in all the fields that we can imagine, the transgender issues, or no matter anti-doping or what else. So I think we are in a good moment to expand the education in all fields, and we will attend all athletes like this.
Thank you, Natalia. Now it's Francina's time.
Thanks again. So Natalia, you read my mind because we have a question at the end for me, but I'm going to answer it now. One of the things that we like to do with EPAS is next year have a kind of a follow-on conference, but with a limited group of experts to really plan how we can create precisely that, an education resource pack. And the idea was this could be rolled out in sports academies, and so that could be part of the training. And that will be done in collaboration with the Council of Europe's SOGI unit, Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity unit. And of course, I wanted to just also mention one of the experts behind the conference on diversity. Carlos mentioned Payoshni Mitra, and really she was such a brilliant activist and help for especially intersex athletes like Annette Negesa, but she was also really spending every waking moment of her day almost for free supporting intersex athletes especially, and she, of course, she'll be helping us to prepare this resource pack, and then the idea is just to disseminate it. So it will take some time. The recommendation wasn't on the cards yet, but that's a good idea, Natalia. I've written it down for the future to think about. But I think really this resource pack is important, you're right, to share it and disseminate it. And that's one way we could do that in the future. So Carlos, you can count on me to contact you for this.
Thank you, Francine. You have just answered what are the further steps for EPAS in this area. Would you like to add something else about this?
I think I pretty much covered the main steps that we're going to do in the future. I mean, the only thing I would say is certainly sharing the, I'll share the links with you straight afterwards. That's an immediate reaction, but I will share the links and the presentation as well with you immediately after, so you can share them as well. Because the idea is that the web pages that talk about the conference become a resource pack in themselves as well. And then we have the study coming out, will be hopefully early next year. And again, that was prepared with Payoshni Mitra, the European Gay and Lesbian Sports Federation, and other experts who came together to draft this study, and we're looking forward to sharing that. We may have to do a little bit of updating because this is before the IOC framework on fairness was released, so we might have to do a small update, or maybe make it clear that it's kind of time bound. And then, of course, the Human Rights Forum, and we hope to discuss precisely this subject and then come up with a resource pack. So I think that's okay for now.
Okay, thank you, Francine. It would be perfect if you could share that with us, and then we will share it with everyone. We are running out of time. Okay, so we are going to make the question in that we have in the chat. This is mostly directed to Natalia because it's an Andorran matter. The question is, I would know if we have tools to treat a case like transgender or intersex in Andorra. If we have some case here someday, and I would like to add to this, if in Andorra, for the confidentiality terms, it would be more difficult to treat this because it's such a small country that sometimes confidentiality could be really difficult. So, Natalia, that's for you.
Thank you for the question. Je suppose qu'on est en train de parler si on a des utiles pour le traiter à niveau dopage. Pour l'instant, il n'y a pas des utiles ou de non-utiles liées au dopage ou à la lutte contre le dopage. Le sujet, je crois qu'il faut le transporter aux fédérations, non? Si les régulations du sport en concret permettent ou permettent pas de participer d'un côté ou de l'autre, c'est ce que va nous permettre de gérer la situation. Donc, je crois que nous sommes juste au début de cette situation. Il n'y a pas des régulations sur toutes les fédérations, donc en Andorre, pas du tout non plus. Donc, chaque fédération nationale devra s'adapter aux régulations des fédérations internationales pour pouvoir le gérer à niveau national. Je ne m'en rappelle plus de la deuxième partie.
La deuxième partie, c'est que Andorre, c'est très petit. Et si
oui, bon, je crois que c'est une obligation. Ça ne dépend pas de la dimension du pays, non? C'est une obligation de gérer les données sur quel soit le domaine. Et à niveau antidopage, on essaye de complir avec ça. On est obligé. On a plusieurs régulations à niveau international et national qu'il faut complir. Et je crois qu'il n'y aurait aucun problème. Parfois, il y a les médias qui sont des... je ne sais pas comment dire, non, mais son espaparres. Ils essayent toujours de trouver des lack of mais je crois que si on fait notre boulot de forme professionnelle, on va réussir à protéger les données, les athlètes et à faire ce qu'il faut faire pour chaque cas et sur chaque processus, chaque point du processus. Alors, j'en aurai pas de souci sur ce domaine. Je ne sais pas si vous savez, mais là, ça fait un mois, plus ou moins que ça. En Andorre, on a approuvé la nouvelle loi de protection de données qui s'équipare vraiment à celle de l'Europe. Alors, nous sommes tous sujets à les mêmes régulations, donc je ne crois pas qu'il y ait des soucis sur ce domaine.
Merci beaucoup, Natalia. Votre réponse était parfaite parce qu'à la fin, je pense le même que vous. Ce n'est pas de question du tamanho, de la mesure du pays, mais de régulation et que ça soit le même pour tout le monde. Merci à vous tous pour votre participation, Madame Francine, Monsieur Carlos, Monsieur Caïn et Madame Natalia. Merci aussi à Patrick pour votre intervention dans le chat. Et je passe la parole pour finir à Nadia On, qu'elle veut faire un petit rapport.
Hi everybody, I will speak in French because I speak better in French. Non, je voulais juste dire par rapport à tout ce qu'on a parlé, surtout pour rejoindre ce que nous a dit Natalia sur par exemple, la différence entre les ressources ou l'éducation. Je pense que c'est des sujets vraiment tabous. Ce qu'on appelle aujourd'hui, par exemple, au début, on se disait est-ce que les personnes vont adhérer à cette table ronde ou pas, par exemple. Et je pense que c'est très important, surtout, c'est ce qu'on dit, non, peut-être dans les petits pays, il y a les pour et les contre, mais le pour, c'est qu'on est très petit, qu'on en parle peut-être plus facilement. Et je pense que la partie éducation et la partie communication qu'on fait avec ces tables rondes ou avec les conférences que vous proposez, par exemple, à l'EPAS, c'est le plus important pour essayer un peu d'effacer ces sujets tabous, d'en parler ouvertement pour qu'à la fin, justement, il y ait toute la partie juridique qui puisse avancer et qu'à la fin, ce soit des sujets qui puissent avancer. Et je pense qu'il y a la partie éducation qui est très importante et c'est aussi l'ARAD fait un travail très important sur éduquer, travailler avec les fédérations. On est aussi en train d'essayer de travailler un peu avec l'AGAT, nous au secrétariat d'État et avec les fédérations pour essayer justement de travailler tout ça. Donc voilà, je voulais vous remercier aussi à tous de votre présence ici. C'est un honneur de pouvoir compter parmi vous et aussi aux personnes qui ont participé à cette table ronde. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup, Nadia. Et je suis totalement d'accord avec vous. Et merci aussi à Madame Koznik. Elle a fait l'introduction au principe à l'inice de la conférence. Et maintenant, elle est avec nous dans le chat aussi. Elle a fait quelques apportations très intéressantes. Et bon, on va clore la conférence. Et pour les conférenciers, si vous pouvez rester une minute, et ici on va parler un moment. Et pour le reste, merci beaucoup d'avoir été ici, avoir vous connecté, excusez-moi mon français, de vous avoir connecté avec nous. J'espère que cette conférence a été intéressante et productive pour vous. Et j'espère aussi que ce sujet, on peut le parler plus ouvertement, comme disait Nadia, et qu'on finit avec les tabous qu'on a. Tabou. Et bon, c'est ça. Merci beaucoup à tous et bonne fin de la journée. Ah, excusez-moi, on a une autre conférence à 8 heures. Si vous voulez vous connecter à 8 heures, il y en a une sur pour clore
el tuo il dia d'ailleurs.
Sí. Lo de les conflictos.
Ah oui, sur les conflits par rapport, désolé, sur les conflits par rapport à tout ce qui est les sports d'équipe. En fait, c'est un spécialiste qui traite un peu les problèmes. Par exemple, je pense que ça aussi, ça se joue un peu au stade, par exemple, donc les problèmes avec le public, le problème avec les comportements dans le terrain et hors terrain. Et donc, c'est un spécialiste espagnol qui nous parlera de tout ça à 19h30 si ça vous intéresse. On peut vous envoyer le lien. Voilà, ben merci beaucoup à tous.